This video is for The Living Earth, Unit 3.6, Mechanisms for Evolution. Today's essential question is, how do natural selection and adaptation impact biodiversity? Natural selection is an evolutionary mechanism that results in the differential reproductive success of different species. This is when some individuals of a species leave behind more offspring than others. If this is the result of genetic variation, then these advantageous changes are passed on to future generations. Scientists use the word adaptation to describe the physical and behavioral changes that enable successful reproduction. So, what is the relationship of natural selection to adaptation and to the development of diversity within and among species? Natural selection is most easily understood at the level of the individual. Those individuals that leave behind descendants are favored. In time, the genes of reproductively successful individuals will come to dominate a population's gene pool. This eventually results in evolutionary change at the level of a population or a species. Diversity within a species commonly arises when populations of a species are separated in some way. The genetic composition of these isolated populations may change over time as each separated population experiences different mutations and is exposed to different selective pressures. Eventually, the gene pools of the species become so different that reproductive barriers build up. These barriers could take a variety of forms, including behavioral differences such as preferences in selecting a mate, to genome incompatibility. At this point, the populations cannot interbreed and can be considered two separate species. As different species compete for limited resources, differential reproduction will result in the populations of each species having traits that are different from each other. It will favor traits that make a species particularly well suited to a niche within an ecosystem. Each species can occupy a niche that is not being contested by the other. In this way, natural selection fosters diversity among species.
What is genetic diversity? E.O. Wilson and other scientists studying life on Earth believe that there are three types of biodiversity: genetic, species, and ecosystem diversity. Remember that genes are the basic units of life. They exist in the cells of all living creatures. Genes are also the basic units of heredity, which means that they determine which traits are passed down from parent to child. Genetic diversity refers to a variety of genes in a species. Genes are responsible for both the similarities and differences among a species. Each species consists of individuals who have their own specific genetic combination. This means that within a species there may be different populations, each composed of different genetic combinations. To preserve this vitally important genetic diversity, these different populations must thrive. Just think about the differences between the types of tomatoes in my garden, or different breeds of dogs, or the similarities and differences among humans. It is important to remember that this diversity evolved over millions of years. Genetic diversity provides a mechanism for populations to adapt to their changing environment. The more variation among the population of a species, the better the chance that at least some of the individuals will inherit genes suited for the new environment and will produce offspring with that better suited gene combination, which will in turn continue the population into subsequent generations of the species. The loss of genetic diversity can lead to a reduced fitness to withstand a changing environment. Animals that are endangered species have small populations and tend to lose genetic diversity. Scientists are concerned that animals across the globe are facing a lack of genetic diversity among their species. For example, they believe that a lack of genetic diversity is making the population of Tasmanian devils susceptible to a deadly facial cancer that is devastating its population in Australia. Research suggests that the current population of Tasmanian devils descended from the very small numbers of the species left after concerned farmers almost hunted this unique animal into extinction. Because today's Tasmanian devils came from this very small gene pool, there isn't much variation in the genes of their immune systems, so many are unable to fight facial cancer if it strikes. When genetic variation disappears, the basis of life on Earth is weakened. Let's review what we have learned about genetic diversity. Question 1. The basic units of heredity are known as what? A. Molecules. B. Atoms. C. Genes. D. Mitochondria. The correct answer is C. Genes are the basic units of heredity. Question 2. The term genetic diversity refers to what? A. Genetic variations among a single species. B. Differences in the genetic composition between species. C. Differences in species habitats. D. A and B. If you answered A, you know that genetic diversity refers to the differences in the genetic composition of a single species. Question 3. A lack of genetic diversity has led Tasmanian devils to be susceptible to what disease? A. Stomach cancer. B. Facial cancer. C. Arthritis. D. Pneumonia. If you answered B, you know that Tasmanian devils are susceptible to facial cancer.
Types of natural selection. Within the process of natural selection, there is variety as to how traits are selected. Natural selection is probably most often connected to directional selection. In this type of natural selection, a single beneficial phenotype is favored, increasing allelic frequency to shift in the direction of that phenotype. Since individuals having this trait are more likely to survive and reproduce, the trait's allele frequency increases in the population. Throughout the generations, more and more members of the population will possess that trait. Directional selection is most often seen when there are environmental changes or when populations move to new areas with different environmental influences. The evolution of a giraffe's neck exemplifies directional selection. As food became scarce, those individuals that could reach to higher branches were more likely to survive. The trait for long necks then became more prominent. Disruptive or diversifying selection occurs when extreme phenotypes are favored and selected instead of those with average or intermediate phenotypes. Disruptive selection increases diversity in and among species. Darwin's finches are an example of this type of selection. As mid-sized seeds became scarce on the Galapagos Islands, the birds were forced to rely on large or small seeds. These birds, with either unusually large or unusually small beaks, were better adapted to the environment. Thus, they survived, reproduced, and passed on these extreme traits. The opposite situation is true in stabilizing selection, which reduces diversity within a species. Stabilizing selection describes changes in population genetics in which intermediate forms of a trait are favored. Much like the story of Goldilocks, stabilizing selection favors those traits that are not too much or too little, but just right. The birth weight of babies is one such trait that follows a stabilizing selection pattern.
Darwin argued that species change over time and, as a result, become adapted to their environments. For example, the blue feet of this booby are an adaptation. Females are attracted to males with bright blue feet, so the males with this adaptation are more likely to reproduce and pass this trait on to their offspring. Likewise, if an adaptation gives an organism a competitive advantage over others of its kind, such as strong legs for swimming and diving here on Galapagos, that organism is more likely to survive and pass the trait on to the next generation. Over time, These beneficial adaptations can build up in isolated populations, like those of the Galapagos, and may give rise to a new species. Galapagos marine iguana provides compelling evidence for Darwin's ideas. It's believed that the ancestors of marine iguanas were originally land iguanas that may have come to the islands on floating logs. But food on these volcanic islands was scarce. During the competition for food, some iguanas found success by venturing into the waters. The land iguanas with slightly better tails for swimming or shorter snouts for eating off of rocks had an advantage over iguanas without these traits. Darwin argued that over millions of years, the iguanas with physical traits that made them good divers had a better chance of surviving and therefore of producing more offspring. Over the generations, a greater percentage of iguanas inherited these beneficial traits. Eventually, the marine iguanas evolved into a separate species from the land iguanas. Darwin called this process natural selection. Organisms with beneficial adaptations were effectively selected by nature to have a better chance of either surviving in their current habitat or occupying a new habitat. Darwin found creatures with unique adaptations all across the Galapagos, and modern researchers continue to find them. The swallow-tailed gull's big red eyes give them a competitive advantage over other gulls in finding food.
The swallow-tailed gull is unusual among gulls in that it has a very much enlarged eye, which is a beautiful adaptation for feeding nocturnally. The swallow-tailed gull feeds mainly on bioluminescent type organisms that light up the surface of the sea at night.
So these gulls have evolved to take advantage of a food source that no other gulls can. These adaptations help to ensure their survival. There is a different species of finch on each Galapagos island. Isolated on each island, each has its own unique behaviors and beak size and shape. Some eat like woodpeckers, some eat cactuses, and others use tools. But they each find food in their own way and pass their successful adaptation on to the next generation. Beneficial adaptations can also help species live side by side and still avoid competition. For instance, hawkfish with long snouts can coexist in the same waters as the short-nosed variety because one finds food in crevices while the other finds it on top of rocks and coral.
At this point, you should be able to generate a full and appropriate response to today's essential question. How do natural selection and adaptation impact biodiversity?